Welcome to the Innovantage Podcast, where business meets tech to bring you the competitive edge. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about AI and education, and specifically about generative AI and education, the role it plays, the limitations it has, and the role it will play somewhere in the future. I am your host, Max, and today I am joined by my wonderful guests, Mr. Dominik Lukes, to help me work on this topic. Dominik, hi.
Hello, Max.
Welcome. Welcome to the show. Glad to see you here. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself? What is it that you do? Why is it that you are here? And I would love to hear more thoughts about your ideas about it.
So that's a very good question. Why am I here? Very specifically, I'll still try to narrow it down somewhat. So at the moment, I work at the University of Oxford, and I run the Reading and Writing Innovation Lab. And one of the things that I've been doing for the last few years is looking at technologies that can help read and write. And that, of course, includes AI. And I've been looking into AI since before ChatGPT was a thing. I've started running sessions on AI in education here since about 2019. But I've actually, me and AI go way back. I first took a course in AI in the early 90s, in speech recognition, but also that was at the end of the first or maybe the second craze of neural networks. Back then we called it connectionism. And then all of that sort of died. It stopped working when I was still a student. I was looking into linguistics and computational linguistics and so diverged from that and started studying things like metaphor and so on, and then ended up doing education and helping people with technologies for for how to make sense of the world of the reading and of the written word and the academic conceptual world. And then about sort of mid 2010s, AI came back and it started being exciting again. We got better speech recognition. All of a sudden, we could get images recognized. Nobody ever thought that would be anywhere near. And then we got, of course, the excitement came about GPT-2. That was in 2018, I think. And then in a few years, that kind of looked, well, that's just a flash in the pan. We were all kind of not necessarily all that excited about it. It was interesting, but many people thought it might be a dead end. Then we had GPT-3 come out, and then we had ChatGPT. And of course, that has lit the fire under everybody with all its powerful semantic features and abilities, and that's where we are. People became a lot more interested in what this thing called AI does, and I've started running sessions at Oxford and at a bunch of conferences for educators and technologists in education about AI. I've probably talked to close to 1,000 people across various platforms, and it seems like AI has taken over not just the world, but also the world of me. My mental space is easily occupied by all the things that are coming through that AI pipeline.
So would you say that your life has gotten better or worse? Let's make a local test whether or not AI is doing a good thing for the society or not. Is your personal life doing better or worse?
So I have lots of examples where people's lives have gotten better because of this. And that's, for example, my friend in the Czech Republic is running a small business, a small school, and she's using it all the time. I showed her ChatGPT in the summer, and just a free version helping her in Czech draft a business plan. So kind of bounce ideas with each other, help with drafting ads for interns, and things like that. So that's an incredibly powerful tool for somebody, right? And we didn't have to wait for somebody to localize it because it has this sort of multilingual capacity out of the box, despite the fact that it occasionally makes more mistakes in Czech than it does in English. Nevertheless, that's very useful. But if you just look online, people say it's helped me with my job. It's helped me. It's sort of this little hidden thing that's helping people make their lives more effective. Even kind of emotional issues, right? There's people, I heard of a colleague says, well, I really hate ChatGPT, but this morning I asked it to make my email less angry that I was about to send to somebody. Right? So that, in a way, even though their feeling about ChatGPT is negative, but actually they're using it for a positive thing, right? So I think in general, the world's gotten better. Of course, there's one small group of people in the world whose world has gotten slightly more complicated. Whether better or worse is a different question. And those are people in education, particularly people who are concerned about things like exams. right? And particularly people who are concerned about take-home exams, where you ask somebody to do something on their own,
Yeah.
and they bring you back a result, and then you think, okay, well, they can now do something because what they showed me they can do. But of course, we're living in a world where somebody has called this, I think it was Ethan Molly called this the end of homework. And essentially, you can no longer pretty much trust that anybody who will have done that has done it entirely on their own. So things like composition, spelling, all of these things AI can take care of you. And increasingly, we're seeing tools that can do much more. That can, and as we're seeing some of these developments in terms of the extended context window, and extended multimodal capabilities, so some better agentivity, where all of a sudden we're seeing some nice features coming through with the first glimmers of agents that can do a bit of research and come back with and take pauses. They're very much imperfect. They cannot do it for you right now, but that's something that's already on the horizon, and I would expect that we'll get somewhere that's maybe never perfect, but very, very good in about a year's time. So in some ways, we have this landscape now, and we're sort of, as we're continuing through it, we're discovering these new horizons of possibilities, and we're not quite sure what the plateau will be, but we do know that it's going to improve a little bit more. And even if the underlying technology didn't improve much, we know we still have a lot of the current stuff to mine for capabilities and clever uses. So I think that's kind of the situation there, with that one area of the world where perhaps some people are slightly a bit more concerned about the impact on their lives.
But you are more optimistic in the end, I see.
Well, I am very optimistic, particularly because in some ways it narrows the gaps, right? So this is a tool that narrows the gaps. And of course, sometimes the people who previously had an edge have less of an edge, because all of a sudden being able to write something in an interesting, sort of a cogent manner, all of a sudden isn't nearly as much of an advantage in the world. So that's an example that, of course, somebody might lose that, but that's just how the advance of technology goes. So we'll have to sort of figure out how to deal with that and see if the people who are actually already good at this, can they just use it to augment what they can do now, and then still continue reaping the benefits as well, alongside those who perhaps previously struggled a bit more.
Oh, yeah. I studied linguistics and specifically interpretation myself in college, and I excelled in that particular area where, I wrote very nicely in all aspects, like an official email or, a creative writing exercise, and compared to my peers, at least, I was very proud of that skill set. But now that skill set is almost obsolete. And I'm not sure how I feel about that, but, I just have to live with it now.
I think the internal pride doesn't have to go away, right? People still play chess, even though all the computers are better. All the best computers are better than even the best chess players.
Not true.
People, sometimes we have mass-produced clothes that are much better than in terms of quality and what you can knit, but still people knit and make things at home, and there's some value in that. So I think people will still want to do it, and of course, there's a benefit to writing, for example, just writing for yourself, helping you clarify your thoughts. And people who write to clarify their thoughts, often think everybody's writing is beneficial for that. But actually, if you study writing a bit more closely, you realize lots of people, just the process of composition is so cognitively demanding that they don't have a lot of space left for thinking. So in some ways, that's, whether you're writing a first language or because of dyslexia, or just because, it's not perhaps something you've learned enough fluency in that, then you may actually be struggling with getting the benefit of it. And all of a sudden, if something can take off some of that cognitive load away from you, then all of a sudden you can actually use that written word a little bit more to help you sort of structure your thoughts and develop better ideas.
I agree. And I'm living in Lithuania right now, in Vilnius, but I wasn't always that way. And naturally, Lithuania has its own language, a very wonderful language with a very rich history, but a language that I unfortunately speak very, very badly, like none at all. And with tools like ChatGPT, you can actually gain much more as somebody like me, like as an immigrant, where you come into a new society and you have some background knowledge of, how to speak and what you want to say, but you don't have the tools in terms of language to do those. ChatGPT actually helps, especially with like an email to a bank to open up a new account, or like to an immigration service to tell them where you live, or whatever else. Because, studying interpretation and translation has always been kind of a challenge to translate what you want to say rather than the words that you're using to say those things. And it's very nice to have that tool. And yeah, the point you're making about having the space to think, with the skill set of actually having to write a lot of stuff myself, I often see ChatGPT, for myself at least, as like an editor, a nice editor that never gets tired of my ramblings, that can give me some pointers. Some of them good, some of them not so good, but at least it's always available. It's always there. So it's also very kind of nice augmentation already, that not an obvious one.
Yeah, I think it's definitely the case that there's a very good thinking companion, and sometimes people don't realize the potential because everybody kind of thinks in the chatbot interface. But one of the features that I always tell people about is in ChatGPT, the mobile app, that you have instead of using dictation on your phone, which many people do, that's usually integrated in your keyboard, you can just use that little speech button in the chat in the chat area, in the prompt area, and dictate. Not dictate, but rather ramble into your prompt, and just kind of stream of consciousness. You can backtrack, right? If you dictating, backtracking is the death of dictation with speech recognition. But this uses the more interesting model, Whisper, which isn't actually doing dictation, which is just kind of understanding holistically what you're saying. It's a bit more complicated, so it uses segments and everything, but essentially it can sort of make sense of it and translate, for example, bits of language that you may be including a bit of French or a bit of Lithuanian in that same speech, and it will transcribe it as Lithuanian. But most importantly, then ChatGPT's sort of semantic ability to clean up the rambling can help you, give you a list of points, or just going to give it in something a bit more cogent. So that's something that I know some students that I've talked to use it for that way. It's just going to just have a bit of a chat, kind of clear their mind, and then they will create that. They will start creating some of the structures for them.
Yeah, that's also a very nice use case. It's very, very prudent, I think. And your official title in Oxford is a Assistive Technology Officer, right? As far as
That's correct, yes.
And you mentioned yourself that we're currently somewhere in a place where maybe it's the death of homework. So in your environment, I'm not sure how that is viewed. How often do you see it in your own day-to-day, or maybe in your peers, or maybe your colleagues? How do you address it? Okay, so homework is dead, right? How do you stimulate then learning? How do you make sure that the students actually do stuff and make that knowledge their own?
Well, in many ways, Oxford has an advantage because of the tutorial system. So a lot of the education is happening in small groups, back in, people having discussions. So when a student submits a paper, they have to talk about it afterwards. So a lot of these things are not an issue. But obviously, people are thinking about how can we introduce sort of different checks in the exam situation. A lot of our examinations are still happening in an invigilated environment, so we're seeing what the students are using. But if we're doing sort of take home, then people are thinking about maybe we'll have conversations with select people, and not just because we think they might use AI, but because it's a good way of confirming what they said. So we may sort of have a subset of people just going to do a spot check, and so those are some ideas people are thinking about. So in some ways, but also it's important to remember I'll always run into students who just haven't tried this, who haven't really used it that much. Everybody thinks this will be very common, but actually it's still a new technology. So we're not necessarily seeing it, we're not seeing it entirely widely adopted, and also not always, people are not always kind of using the more advanced models, getting the best out of it. So I would say in some ways at the moment, we're sort of in that learning stage rather than having a solution. But it's certainly something people are discussing, and it will take a while before we all settle on some answers and have a lot of clarity. But in general, I think the perception education has been cautiously optimistic, right? So people are seeing the benefits. People are seeing that obviously there are some challenges to the integrity of the exam, but the benefits for learning and the benefits for sort of expanding inclusion definitely are just as keenly appreciated, and people are looking at those quite seriously as well.
I see. So it is still a discussion that's nice to hear. And from what I've heard about educational circles, at least, the kind of the general consensus is that, try and control it. You're not your Oxford professors, of course, but your run-of-the-mill, more like school teachers, for example. How do you control homework is being done? And I hear and see a lot of school teachers resort to ChatGPT checkers that, you just input the texts and then it tells you whether or not it was generated by AI. What are your thoughts on that?
I think, well, there's still, it's up for debate, the future of these things. And
Sure.
one of the things that they have a place, for example, if you're getting lots of submissions. So, for example, one of the issues that you have to deal with when you're training new models is that you have vast corpora of data, literally trillions of words.
Yeah.
And you may want to clean them a little bit and maybe exclude some or get a sense of what are the different patterns. And so running an algorithm like that could help, because you could say, okay, well, we're going to make a balance of these, even though we're not 100% sure about any one of them. We may get a sense of the balance of our corpus, right? So I think as a tool, it's not a useless tool. As a tool, I can give you definitely this bit was written by a large language model and this was written by a person. You're not going to get that ever, I don't think, because of the variability. But you may get some indications, but we do know that people have started thinking about doing some sort of a hidden fingerprinting in text by simply biasing slightly the output of the model. But I think that hasn't so far borne any fruit. And OpenAI had a project that they canceled in the spring, about a year ago, because they just said they just couldn't get to the level of reliability that would make this useful. So that I think is still an open question, an open problem. So I wouldn't necessarily want to say what the future will bring, but at the moment there is nothing that you could say is reliable to the level that you would need for checking. And also we have to remember that the models are changing. So it's not necessarily the thing that worked last month, it may not work this month, because the companies are constantly fine-tuning the models, the outputs, some of the weights they're going into the output generation. So at the moment, I think it would be it's a bit of it would be too premature to say we have a tool to do this, and it is entirely possible we will never have a tool to do this. But at the same time, I cannot necessarily say that we know for certain that we never will.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I can understand that. Yeah, it's very hard to predict the future, and a lot of people would not have expected ChatGPT to be what it currently is, as an example. And you mentioned a lot of specific terms, like large language models and training those models and fingerprinting within the data sets that those models are trained with and fine-tuning those models. Can you maybe explain a few of those terms for those of our listeners and viewers who are not that familiar with the terms themselves?
Okay.
Simplify it a little bit.
Well, these things are, I would say, weird and different. So sometimes one of the dangers here is to giving a lot of metaphors, and because then people we're just going to carry over the things from the thing we're comparing it to and not really necessarily develop understanding. So I'm going to try to be both sort of use some analogies, but try to be quite specific. And there's, I guess, the easiest term in there is a model, right? And so any AI tool is based on a model, and essentially a model is a set of parameters that if you feed something into it will give you something back. So in the very simplest terms, a regression curve is a model, right? And then you could say, okay, you feed it some number and it's going to spit out another number, like a function. It's a model of sort, right? And then many people say that actually the models using AI are essentially functions. So you can feed it something in, it will give you an output. But that's not a very helpful understanding. That's quite close to the literal truth, but it's not actually that helpful. So the models that we're using for something like ChatGPT are models that generate language. So that's what makes it generative, and they're language models. But of course, what makes them large is the requirement for scale that was necessary to make these. And so if you use the free version of ChatGPT, that used a corpus of about 500 billion words or thereabouts, which is an enormous number. And most of them were in English, for example, but enough in other languages that could also sort of pick up the other languages. And then with the GPT-4 and some of these other bigger models, we don't know exactly because OpenAI didn't disclose it, but we know recently Meta released a new large language model called Llama 3, and they said they used 15 trillion tokens, which is essentially about 12 trillion thereabouts words. Right. Oh, wow. So all of a sudden, that is almost 20 times as many as GPT 3.5, and you're getting also commensurate quality improvements. But that's the scope, just the data you need to train. That's what makes it large. But of course, then you need a number of parameters, and the parameters are in the hundreds of billions. So there are some very small models, by quote unquote small, that have maybe 8 billion, that will perhaps not do that much, but not be as sophisticated. But the biggest models will have in the hundreds of billions. And so the problem is we don't have any intuitions what that means, right? So that's kind of what that's just kind of to explain what the size of the model. Now, what are the models of? What do they look like, right? So I mentioned the regression curve, which is kind of a prediction curve, right? You put in some data and you predicts what the most likely matching data is. And people often say that ChatGPT just predicts the next word.
Yeah. And autocomplete on steroids is what they say.
Yes, right? Autocomplete on steroids. But that's actually not a very good analogy, because it puts you in the mind of statistics, that is frequency. So like we said, the frequencies of occurrences of words, and just kind of repeats those patterns. But in fact, and so some people do say large language models are just applied statistics. But that, I would say, is almost literally not true, because if you look inside the model, it doesn't have any frequencies. There are no frequencies inside these models. Instead, it has weights and relationships. And so I always say, actually, that large language models are applied geometry rather than statistics. And that is also literally true, because the reason they use graphics, everybody's heard about GPUs, graphics cards being used for training, maybe many people have. And that's because they actually literally computing vectors. That's they're in vast matrices that have many dimensions, up to sort of 10,000 dimensions. And those vectors represent the relationships of different parts of words together. And so that kind of gives us that ability to figure out quite sophisticated relationships. But those relationships are not there. There's some sort of basic semantic relationships, such as like a king and queen are related by king. If you subtract the vector for man from king and add the vector for woman, you get queen. So that's very kind of a typical example. But but it's actually much more complicated to get the level of sophistication we're getting. We also have this other layers, which is called attention. And that makes it decides, when you give it a long text, which bits are more important than others and which bits belong together. So it gets very complicated. But essentially, most of the stuff is encoded inside a large language model as a system of relationships that are represented by these multidimensional matrices or vectors. And that's what most of the multiplications, most of the math that's going on inside is this. And there's some bit of probability at the end, because you need to choose which ones you're choosing, but the choice is kind of happening based on geometry rather than on statistics. So that's kind of what I wanted to say. So I always say that these are sort of semantic machines, and they're semantic in the sense they understand relationships between things, but they're not semantics in the sense they don't understand the world outside themselves, right? So they only everything they've learned is through the relationships. So and if you think about it, in our own language, most of the things we've learned from context as well. We didn't learn most of the things, like the word the, right? You cannot point at the. You can point at cat and you can point at even a museum, right? But you cannot point at the or even the word get, right? I mean, it has so many different meanings that the complexity of the word get, you can just read the definition in a dictionary and be able to use it. So that's kind of like us, but with us, we do have that seed of the real world, right? We have bodies, and the bodies can have vision and perception. Large language models don't have any of that. So that's kind of where I would like to sort of maybe point people to thinking about this is kind of a geometric semantics. And we never thought we could get this far without some of that seed of the real world experience, but it turns out we can. And so that's kind of really what's going under the hood, is these sort of semantic models called large language models that can sort of generate more text. And that would be the thing that I would say maybe might help people to start thinking about it. But there are some other properties of these. And so that, in a way, if you think about the word ChatGPT, we've covered the G and the T. So the G is the fact that it generates, it doesn't just give you a label. But then there's the T, which is the sort of this architecture that I just described called a transformer. That's what it stands for, generative pre-trained transformer. But then we have two more aspects of that name, ChatGPT, that I think are important to understand. So the middle one is P, stands for pre-trained. And that's another really important breakthrough in AI in the last 15 years or so, is that we don't have to train AI for every single task separately. You can actually take all these 15 trillion tokens or so or words and pre-train a model with some basic cognitive, quote unquote, capabilities.
Mhm.
And then you can do what's called fine tuning on top of that, and make it do other things. So, for example, so the P gives us that the ability to take this huge, enormously expensive, and it costs, you have sort of millions and millions worth of graphics cards running maybe for 3 months before you do the pre-training. So these are not cheap and easy things to do. But you can then take them and fine tune them for much less money. I mean, it could still be hundreds of thousands of millions, but it's much less time to do things like have a chat. So in the original model, the GPT-3, when it first came out, it couldn't have a conversation because when you ask it a question, where is Prague? It may just answer with another question, like where is Paris? Because just as likely in the text that you have a text of series of questions as questions and answers. So what ChatGPT, the big breakthrough for ChatGPT was this invention of the fine-tuning protocol that OpenAI developed, and that essentially now means when you type in a question, it gets a sense that you're doing a question, has a chat with you. And and then there's further levels of fine tuning on top of that. That, for example, try to balance some of the, stop it from saying things like, how to steal a car and things like that. So those are, you can sort of fine tune that model. There's a raw capability, which is what the P gives you, and there's a fine tuning, and that you can do lots of things. For example, teach it how to write an essay better, things like that. And you have to use much less data, but much better quality. And that's often human created data and so on. So I think that's another important thing people often don't realize is that these models are kind of trained in layers. You don't just going to run. Often people say, "I've just trained on the entire internet," but that's not true. It has to be. It uses select, even though it's masses of data, but the data has to be clean, has to be sort of quite carefully selected within sort of for abilities of us on our algorithm, and then it has to be so pre-trained and then fine-tuned for a particular purpose, so such as a chat or a model that you may be using for certain things. And that I think is kind of useful to know.
Okay, I'm trying to wrap my head around it, right? I'm trying to put it in very simple terms in my mind, and it's still a very complex task to accomplish. Like it feels like it's simplified already. It feels like it's sure, it's a model that you can chat with and that is fine-tuned, and that's kind of the main differentiating factor from any technology that came beforehand. But then again, in reality, you can, when you interact with it, when you use it, you can definitely see why some people think that it might be sentient. But the more you kind of understand the limitations of it, the more you understand what it can and cannot do. And I think that's one of the things that you've mentioned is like, knowing what words associated are with others, and like the word get, for example, right? How to use it where and what context and what it is. But at the same time, not the truth of things, whether or not it's factual or not. It just needs to look like factual, right? It needs to look to the human eye.
I think that is true, but I'm just going to be a bit wary. One of the issues is, so I'm just going to explain how these things work in a extremely simplified, and I know, so they didn't necessarily feel that simplified, but simplified, and so not quite as accurate way that sometimes you might want to. But one of the next lesson from this is that knowing how these models are made doesn't tell you anything about how they work. So that's really kind of, so in some ways you cannot really estimate the limitations you're going to see from just how the training data, or from what the training process is, or what the algorithms are that are used for the training process. And somebody recently told me this sort of said, it feels like we didn't invent AI, but we discovered it, and now we're poking in it in a lab. And one of those things that people are saying, you have to spend time with these models, right? It's not something it's not like a normal app where I can just say, you click here, and it's every time you click here, it's going to do this, right? It doesn't give you the same level of feedback that normal software does that we're used to. And so one of the things that is perhaps the most important things to know about these models. So I sort of said about how they're made, what their nature is kind of under the hood. But one of the properties that was discovered was sort of with GPT-3, and there was a paper that announced GPT-3 was called "Large Language Models Are Few-Shot Learners," and that's a rather cryptic title, but I think it's an absolutely essential thing that tells us something essential about large language models. And the few-shot learning is an incredibly misleading term because it just means example following. So it means that if you give it examples, it will follow them. And they can be quite subtle and quite sort of weird. But the more examples you give them, the better these models will work. So within the context of what it can see, there's a limited, what's called a context window, but you can give it 10, 15, even 100 examples, and then you will perform better on the task. And that's not, the learning term in the future of learners is confusing because the model isn't changing. It's not really acquiring new capabilities. But within that conversation you're having, as you give it examples, it can follow those examples. And that is perhaps the most fundamental feature of these models. And once you kind of understand that you can still see what kind of examples can I give them as I'm interacting with this model? What is in the prompt, in my prompt, that can guide the direction of work, of flow. And once you kind of understand that these are example following machines, that they don't necessarily just have all the knowledge on their own, that you can sort of ask and set out the task and show you can do it like this, then all of a sudden that can unlock a lot of possibilities for you when you're using them, because you don't necessarily just think of them as people who you just give them a task and they'll figure it out, but actually something, okay, here are 10 examples of something similar, make me 10 more or 20 more or so on. So I think that is kind of a fundamental feature of these models that many people don't realize. And the reason you don't realize it is because the chat interface doesn't give you any feedback that that's a good way to interact, right? So in a chat, you don't necessarily, there's nothing about the chat that kind of tells you, okay, I would give you better responses if you gave me examples. So that's one of those sort of features of these models, that we have to not only learn from our own interactions, but also look at what other people are saying, how they're using it, and learn from those other people's explorations. And is there a better way of putting those examples? Is there a better way of formulating our prompts and so on? So those I think are some important features to understand and realize that this is a process. It's not something I can tell you about in 20 minutes and then expect you to kind of go away and not only understand what I said, which we know it's quite a lot and quite a lot of abstract things, but also get a feel for what it is like. So you kind of have to get a feel for it through interaction, but interaction has to be augmented by reflection, and by also not just your own reflection, but the collective reflection of humanity at the moment. And so you kind of have to. A lot of my time is spent hanging out on Twitter or X and on Reddit, where people are sharing these ideas. But also, there's more and more research papers are being done on what works, what doesn't, and so those are all the things. We just kind of have to keep an eye on it at the moment and keep learning as we're discovering in our new collective global lab of AI. We're poking this new thing and see how it responds.
That's both a very interesting thought of discovering AI rather than creating it, and a very frightening one, I'm going to be honest with you. And where our poking will lead us.
I know maybe the metaphor is a bit too evocative, but and of course it does respond in sort of quite human way. So it feels like maybe there's something there, but it is what it is, right? So one of the things that people often don't realize is that, as an example, I know some of the people are kind of a bit worried about AI apocalypse. So they're saying, who knows what's going on in GPT's mind? But in fact, we know what's going on, which is nothing, because if nobody's asking you the question, then it's just sitting there. It's just essentially like a blob of numbers on your hard drive. So you can go, some of these smaller models, you can just go and use a tool, for example, like OLLAMA for OpenLlama or LM Studio, download on your computer. If it's powerful enough, you can run these models locally. And when you're not asking any questions, it's just a blob on your hard drive. It's not like thinking there's no churning going on while behind your back. And so these models are the same thing. They're not learning. That's, I guess, the other big lesson people often don't realize. They're not learning live. So people say, I don't want to sort of, it's learning from me, about me. But actually, they're not doing any of that. Those models are quite static. There's no online learning in the way that you and I, even as we're having these conversations, our brains are changing. Right, even as I sleep, my brain is changing because there's always something churning on in there. There's sort of neurons, so interacting with each other, changing their weights a little bit. Whereas AI is not doing any of that while it's working. It's always just the model gets an input and gives you an output. The output is incredibly sophisticated. The model is incredibly sophisticated and complicated beyond our ability to sort of comprehend in all the level of details. But the principles are relatively the same. And any one of those numbers, at any moment, you can go look at them. You just don't necessarily know. It's more like a million-dimensional puzzle. If you pull out, what the puzzle adds up to. Well, when you pull out one of the puzzles at random from a box. If it's 1 out of a million, well, you have no idea which is the next one, right? So I guess that's kind of it's not a black box. It's just like really, it's a giant box with lots of stuff in it, and we have no way of looking at it all at once. But any one of those pieces you can always pull out and have a look at it and see or maybe like a handful of them and see how they relate.
Yeah, thankfully for now. But maybe in the future we will not be smart enough to look at those pieces ourselves. But well, let's get back on topic. Let's talk about education specifically and getting back to the today of things. As far as I understand, you've recently co-authored an article, right? Beyond ChatGPT, the state of generative AI in academic practice.
Yes, and of course, I would like to sort of disagree with the word recently. That was in October, and that in human terms seems recently, but of course in AI terms, that feels like another age. But yes, we did write that report, publish that report at Oxford, and everybody's publishing reports on the state of AI. So that was our attempt, looking at it from the perspective of education, and essentially the reason I call that report Beyond ChatGPT is because in some ways, in many people's minds, AI and ChatGPT were the same. But in about July of last year, that the landscape changed. So we had sort of releases of Claude from Anthropic. Microsoft Copilot became more popular. Google's Bard became a much more useful and interesting tool, which it's now called Gemini, but back then it was still called Bard.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, you would be shortchanging yourself if you were only using ChatGPT, right? And that was when that report was published. We were just seeing the first early glimmers of what multimodal AI can do, which essentially means it can understand images. And so that was like the last bit of that report. So, okay, that's coming. And so that was one aspect of that. Well, I wasn't. It wasn't. It was just gonna. We already saw that. We just that's going to be maybe a bigger part than we thought. So that was one part of the report. Just kind of looking at, okay, we need to start thinking bigger. But the other part of the report was looking at, in a way, the things I was talking about. The fact that it's not necessarily just always concerned about technology itself, the underlying capabilities, as fascinating as they are, but about how are we using them, learning uses, learning the use cases, and learning ways of interactions, and kind of changing ourselves or changing our own knowledge. And that many of the lessons were along those lines. And so so the report talked about things like the fact that we can follow examples, and one particular type of those example following is like chain of thought. When you say, explain this to me step by step. And so that's like an example of something that was, that was learned about those models. You could never figure out, you would never know that's what would work. But because of the research that was happening, we realized, okay, well, actually that makes them better. So those are some examples of things that was on the level of the general usage, but also the fact that we need to understand about the different reactions to prompts and many things, and keep looking at more systematic ways of research. So those were some of the things in there, but also some things that haven't changed were also in their report that kind of are relatively stable, such as the issue of hallucination, right? So the fact that these models can still hallucinate despite massive improvements, and the hallucination isn't necessarily straightforward. But that is still the case. All of these models they're not sort of precision devices. They're not lookup devices. They're sort of these broad semantic machines that help you establish connections. And within that, factuality is not one of their features, even though often they are factual. And so that was another part of it. And the final part was, again, this time borrowing from research done by a group at, I think it was Harvard and several business schools in the US. One of the people there was the famous Ethan Mollick, published a paper about work with consultants, and they called that paper Navigating the Jagged Frontier of AI. And what they meant by jagged frontier was the idea is that we have a smooth curve of our expectations of the area of what AI should be able to do. And then AI has its own capabilities, and those are not smooth. Their capabilities are kind of intersect with our frontier of expectations, and sometimes they exceed it by far, and sometimes they fall short enormously. So, for example, AI is really good at explaining mathematical concepts, but it's really awful at doing the actual math. So you can explain E equals mc squared, but it can multiply 256,000 by 6,056,000 or something like that. So
Mm.
reliably. So that's an example of something that's sort of the mismatch between what we think is easy and what we think is difficult. That may not always be the same for AI, and we never quite know until we try. So those are some of the lessons in that report. So it was like the advances in models, sort of broadening beyond ChatGPT, but also some stable things such as the continual learning, the limitations that are still with us, like hallucination, and then ultimately our inability to kind of tell ahead of time what we will be good at, the necessity that we continue our exploration and learn from our work, but also the work of others.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, yeah. It's funny that October is a very recent time, at least in my life. It feels like yesterday. And in terms of AI and ChatGPT and generative AI and LLMs, it's been quite a while. There's been a few significant steps forward since that time. And maybe you can give us some examples of what specific tools and what capacities are currently being used in the Oxford environment for education specifically.
Yeah, I think in general that's something we're still exploring. So I don't think there's there's necessarily something that we would say that we're using especially and that other people are not. What's happening at the moment? We're right now exploring a trial of the ChatGPT as an the enterprise version and the integration with Copilot and things like that.
Hmm.
We're exploring things like building little experimental tools with AI, right? And so those are all the things that we're trying. Obviously, we're working with students to see what they're finding useful, and so we're as the rest of the world, we're sort of in a learning stage,
Mm-hmm.
and we don't have sort of a settled preferred tool, stuff like that. So I've already mentioned Claude, but from Anthropic, that's a very useful tool that we
Mm-hmm.
often talk to students about, because it's much easier to deal with long context, such as you can upload an entire academic paper, which is different from ChatGPT.
Sure.
But there are many. The tool landscape is changing quite radically in some ways. I mean, we still have the big four, ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, and Copilot. But there's also a lot of people taking the models that are served by these big companies like OpenAI or Anthropic, and using them for different tools. And so, for example, one of the popular tool that I often show people is Elicit, that helps with
Hmm.
your research review, where you
Hmm.
can search for papers and extract information from them. Again, you still have to kind of do your own checking, but it's a really good first draft. So that's a tool that we look at. People look at often. There are many other sort of capabilities that we're just getting to grips with. So I know people are trying to explore the recent release. Well, not that recent. It was released just before Christmas. The idea of GPTs. So we essentially make a little custom bot within ChatGPT or within Copilot,
Yeah.
and so people are experimenting with that right now. And I know some people are also using the APIs to kind of build their own outside of that Copilot or ChatGPT context. So those are some things that we're also looking at. But in some ways, we're kind of in that stage where everybody's just trying to see what can it do for us now, but also we're starting to explore what can it do for us in the future. What are the possibilities? And I'm just going to say the boring thing. We're still learning and discovering along with the rest of the world. So that's but we did start a group here at Oxford called Building with AI, and we're actually just in the process of hiring some AI engineers to help us develop some prototyping tools. And I know some people around Oxford already kind of integrating some of these features into other apps and just seeing what we can do. What are some of the benefits? But that's all kind of a long term exploration that's still ahead of us, and we're of course very excited about what is to come.
Yeah. Very excited about the boring part of learning at Oxford. Very, very uncharacteristic thing for Oxford to be excited about learning. And I would
Yeah.
agree. I would agree. That's a very, very interesting place to be. Like, there is no one answer for myself in a corporate environment as well. Like, you don't have a tool that does it all. It's just one of the things that you can use for different tools. Custom GPTs, like image creation tools, like Midjourney, for example. And me personally, for example, I use Perplexity AI for search from time to time. It's a nice tool that, circumvents the current landscape of search engines in a way that, I'm not going to pitch the whole tool, but basically when I search for something, I always try to search for something specific. If I want to search for something broad, Google is usually useless. It will give me just search engine optimized stuff that is not really relevant to what I'm, inherently looking for. But things like Perplexity can actually kind of, get under the request and kind of get me on an emotional level of what I would like to read about, and then I can start researching from there rather than having an answer ready for me.
I've used Perplexity quite a lot as well, and then there's you.com, which is their competitor, kind of doing a similar thing. And I think that's like a good example where you can really discover what to use it for, because in some ways it has the research mode, but often it also is hampered by the things it can find. So sometimes it's kind of amazing what it can do, but I've asked it like for a simple task that you would think, oh, that would be really nice, and that's maybe the frontier that we're kind of exploring right now. It's the idea of agents, right? So if you say, so I just wanted to give me a table of the latest benchmark performance of the top frontier models. Right? And that seems like should be a relatively straightforward task. You just have to go search. But you may have to go search 100 sites and figure out and rank them, which ones are the best. But actually, need the Perplexity to know you did even a passable job of this, because they essentially used to finding like a few pages and maybe might be 10 or 20, and if the information is there, they can summarize it for me. But if the information is too distributed and they have to do comparisons, all of a sudden the reasoning interface is not there, right? And that's, we saw that recently with as an AI software writing agent called Devin that made a lot of waves in the AI world, where it can actually do some of these things for software writing, but still it has many limitations. And in some ways, in your personal use, the issue of hallucination that I mentioned gets magnified. The more steps you go through that are without human supervision, the more likely it is to go off the rails. And so hard to kind of keep these things guarded and on track. So that's another one of those things I think that's really the frontier of what everybody's expecting, that maybe when GPT-5, the latest model, will come out, it will make this a bit better, make the agents sort of more reliable. But at the moment, we still don't necessarily have that. We still necessarily have all of that. So I think that's important to kind of remember that we have those limits to acknowledge and deal with them. And sometimes it's to get that frontier. So your first try, I always like to quote when Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, really announced on Twitter the release of GPT-4. He said, well, here's GPT-4, or most capable and aligned model yet. And then he said, but it's always more impressive on first use and not as powerful after you've been with it for a while. So I think that's kind of important to realize that sometimes you have to kind of spend time with these things and explore. But it's not necessarily just exploring what they can do, but also what you can do with them. What are you willing to give up in terms of quality, in terms of reliability? Where are you going to just kind of offload something to somebody else? And the metaphors people often use is the idea of an intern, right? So when you're hiring an intern, or a few interns, then it's not just you learning, them doing work for you, but they're also you learning about what they can do for you. So you can, and sometimes, as many people have discovered, it seems more work to get the intern to learn to do something than to actually do it yourself. So you have to kind of find a space for AI as well in that space. Where is it more work for you to kind of, in this case, kind of learn how to instruct that intern. But on the other hand, the benefit of it is, as somebody has called it recently, Nathan Labens called it the infinite intern. I like that idea. It's an intern that still has all the limitations of any intern, but it has infinite capabilities almost, right? It speaks all the languages, or writes computer code in all many languages, and it can do so many things that no one intern can ever do. But of course, if you had 100 interns and they all had those same limitations, they had to have everything individually explained to them, you would never get anything done, because you'd just be spending time instructing the interns and learning about their capabilities. So we kind of need to have that. We as people have to kind of find that space in ourselves and learn how to kind of rethink what we're doing in the space of the possibilities of these infinite interns, and where can it help us, and where it's just going to help wasting more time for us, and so on.
Like with any intern, right? You need to find a balance of where you teach them and where you learn from them, and when you actually benefit from the work they do. And I very like that phrase, like the infinite internet. It really does very succinctly kind of describe the whole experience if you've been using any of those tools for a while now. And considering the fact that we already touched on this a little bit, like you need a specific skill set to interact with those kinds of interns, what do you think in terms of education? What kind of skill sets do future students will need to have in order to work with those tools effectively? And how can maybe
I don't know.
educational institutions support them if they can?
Yeah, the easy answer is I don't know. Nobody knows, because one of the issues is, so I mentioned earlier the chain of thought idea is the idea that the models work better if you tell them to spell out what they're doing, and that's called the chain of thought because essentially it spells out those things. It's not actually spelling out something that's in its mind because it has no inner monologue. It's essentially the reason it works because it works based on those examples. So it's like essentially giving itself its own examples for to do something. And so if I was teaching you how to use these models in about a year ago, I would have said, well, chain of thought is an important prompting technique. But of course, the model makers have realized, and they fine-tuned the models, that now they do their own chain of thought. So very often when you ask ChatGPT about a problem, it's going to do that sort of like a high school student. It's going to tell you how to solve it first and then solve it. And many people try to solve it by telling, just give me the answer. But that's actually the wrong advice because they're doing that thinking out loud to help themselves give you better results. And in the about a year ago, I would have told you, tell it do it step by step. But now you don't necessarily have to tell it to do it step by step, but you're going to have to not stop it doing it step by step. And so many of these models are kind of going to get better, and the tools that the models are embedded in are going to be sort of have back-end prompts that kind of do some of this for you. So in some ways, I think a lot of these things are going to go away as something you need to know as a normal user about. And so I'm not necessarily sure that there is a skill set that we know it will be it. So people who are making these systems, they will have to continue to develop the skill sets around them. But the people using them, that's probably going to change quite a bit as what they need to know. And the power of these models is they are kind of, they're kind of human in the sense you can just talk to them as you would to a person, and they will be soon fine-tuned that if they don't know what you mean, they'll ask you more questions and things like that. So I think that's also going to come in that, so they will sort of guide you a bit better through that process. So the one skill set people often say it's great for finally the English majors or people who are good communicators will be better at this, but I'm not necessarily sure that is the case either, because the semantics of those models is not the same semantics as the one of a person. So sometimes being very clear to a person is not the same as being clear to a model. So I would say perhaps the best people are the ones who spend time with them and are kind of willing to talk and learn that back and forth. But I wouldn't say there's an easy skill set I could just give you, other than just keep exploring, keep trying it, and don't necessarily just think just because you used it a few times, you kind of explored all of that frontier of capability. You're going to have to also go learn from others. So at the moment, the best I can tell you is continue learning and exploring and getting that skill set. And maybe in a year's or 2 years time, we're kind of like, okay, here it is. This is what the skill set is now, but at the moment, otherwise we don't necessarily have like a set of things you should be able to do.
Oh yeah. That makes sense. Like again, there's no answer to what tool is the best to use in an academic environment, and then there's no answer for the best skill set to use in the same environment. But I have a very unique, well, not unique, but a very interesting experience myself, because in my bachelor's, that was like 15 years ago that I finished it, and when I started it was like 20 years ago. Well, a little bit less than that, but still, it was still the time when even the internet was still being adopted. It was not that implemented in the educational process. There's still some things were online, sure, but a lot of things were still being done in your old school manner, where you go to the library, you take a book, you read it, and then you do your homework, and then you answer it, and so on and so forth. And I've recently completed a master's level education at the Antwerp Management School, not the whole master's, but a part of it, and with those new tools and with a new mindset, and well, being much older and hopefully smarter, at least a little bit. And the way I approached it is that those tools help negate some of the negatives of the educational process, at least for myself. Like, I can only judge from my experience, but the boring parts, like reading a book and finding the information that you need. Sometimes you don't need to read the whole book to find the chapter that supports your thesis or answers the questions that you're looking for. With an old school book, you don't really have a choice. You need to read the book or just scan it or learn to read the book in a way that finds the information for you. With the current tools, you can just upload the book and tell ChatGPT, like, hey, I'm searching for evidence of like a hypothesis that supports like the existence of business processes in this environment. Does this book have anything about it? And ChatGPT more or less can give you the guidelines of whether or not the information is there. And then you can just go and read it. And then most of my time is spent on actually learning the information and interacting with the information rather than searching for it. And there are limitless examples of how that also works. Like in group settings, when we prepare a presentation that we all in the group need to do, ChatGPT helps us structure how we pitch it, who does what. It gives options and solutions to how we can, approach the whole environment. If we have any disagreements between like who should go first, who should go last, go to ChatGPT. ChatGPT offers you a very nice, concise, inoffensive choice of doing this, like an arbiter in group discussions, which makes them more efficient. So like even I can answer the questions of what kind of skill set did I utilize in the day-to-day to make it more efficient, but it was more efficient. At least it felt like it was.
Yeah, that's an interesting example. It also is an example of where you can get lucky. Right. So, for example, what you said about you can upload a book to ChatGPT, it will tell you where the things are. That's actually not true at all. Because ChatGPT cannot see the whole book. Right. ChatGPT. So Claude is better. And now we're seeing this sort of expanding context window with Gemini Pro. But that's an example. But sometimes you can get lucky because one of the issues when you give it like a long text, it can sometimes say things that are true, but not in the text itself. So and there are different areas where it's sort of more quote unquote knowledgeable, being able to better articulate. So I've noticed business is one area where I think it's going to lots of sort of discussions online. But my field, history, linguistics, and particularly certain subsets of linguistics, it's not nearly as knowledgeable. So it will tell me things that are not in the book and also not true when I ask about certain things. I've done a bit of testing there, and it's hard to kind of know. So there's these sort of islands of capability and islands of incompetence, and he's going to have to discover them as well. So it's one of those things that you're going to have to keep all of that in mind. But it's a process, right? And so what you're sort of saying, it's true in principle, but also you're going to have to be mindful of the fact that you always have to discover what you're, what in that particular aspect of your task works well. So I can give you another example of that sort of jagged frontier is that if you're a language teacher and you're trying to prepare materials for students, ChatGPT is going to be really good at, for example, you get a text to give you multiple choice questions about the text, or even multiple choice questions about certain grammatical features with distractors. But it's really going to be relatively bad at fill in the blank exercises, particularly when they have to do with the grammar. And that's because it doesn't necessarily choose the right things to pull the fill in the blank. It's not necessarily going to give the right options in there. So that's an example of like there's two seemingly identical tasks, or very similar tasks, but one of them it's very good at, one of them is fairly bad at. And so they're not useless and not perfect, but there's quite a big disparity in the quality there. So that's an example. It can generate perfectly good language in Russian or Czech or Turkish, but when you ask it to give examples of a particular grammatical feature, it will very soon go off the rails. So it will give you a few good examples and a few bad examples as well. So that's like whereas when it's actually generating text, it almost never makes those mistakes, but it will often make them when it's giving you examples. So that's so sometimes that's why I guess it's really important to kind of always be on guard, particularly as you're using it more extensively and you're trying to sort of make inferences about what's coming, what else you can use it for. So it's really important to kind of keep that in mind a little bit as well when you do that. So again, the lesson is always, you have to continue learning and always be kind of slightly alert about the exact parameters of that jagged frontier. Where exactly are we? What do I expect is possible, and where do these tools kind of fall short, or where do they exceed expectations? And they do both, and it's not necessarily easy to tell ahead of time which will be which.
Oh, yes. But that's also in and of itself a nice example of the type of skill set that will be required from everyone entering into the learning environment, both teachers and students, to know the limitations of the tools that are being used, because there are many of them and they are evolving constantly. And asking the right task from the right tool is already a skill set in and of itself. Like, you absolutely correctly said that, asking ChatGPT to read a book, it will not do that very well. Bless you. No worries. And yeah, like in my example, I needed to like go in chapter by chapter and just limit the text to the amounts that it was able to kind of communicate with me on. And it's also a mechanic of where you understand what kind of chunks you can work with and what kind of tasks you can come into the tools with as well. So it poses a lot of limitations and requirements on everyone in the system.
And I think finally, maybe the most important, not really, I don't know if it's a skill, but it's the ability to, it's self-reflection, right? So what is it, sort of think about what your attitudes, what your sort of process is like and where these things can fit into your process, right? So it's not necessarily just thinking only about the tool, but also about what you're doing, where it can help you. So like you already said, for you, it was important to help you sort of shortcut some of the sort of the drudgery of the sort of reading things. And in business book, that's often, I've read a few, and I know there's often a lot of sort of dead space before you get to the good stuff, right? And particularly for some of them. And whereas if you're doing an English degree, then the reading process is important. So you're gonna have to think about reflecting. Am I trying to sort of substitute for something that's important, or am I just, on the other hand, just kind of avoiding something that's unnecessary, but up until now was important? So that those are all the things that you have to keep in mind as well, and kind of change almost from task to task, and also manage the sort of emotional response you have to sometimes not getting what you want. And I know I talked to somebody, it was almost a year ago, they talked about this emotional roller coaster of using ChatGPT, because one day you'll leave that your session just so excited about, I can just do all of these things, and the next day you go and you try something that feels similar, and it's, this is so useless, and why am I wasting my time? So it's one of those things you have to kind of manage that as well. And we have it with all software, but these large language models are even more can be more frustrating, particularly as you're trying to push and try new things, and realize it feels like you're spending all of your time just giving instructions and so on.
Oh yes, I am very familiar with the feeling, with both of those feelings that you get when working with those kinds of models and tools. But can we talk a little bit about those limitations then? And you've mentioned, I think, a little bit about the beginning, the kind of the effects of those tools that they can have on people with disabilities, with limitations, with learning limitations, or just physical limitations, mental limitations. There's a lot of I wouldn't say research. Naturally, of course, research is being done, but there's a lot of discussions about the impact of AI tools and large language models and generative AI on people with disabilities, and whether or not they will create more opportunities for them to learn more efficiently and easier. Like, for example, text-to-speech, right? Very easy, convenient tool. If you struggle with typing or writing, you can easily dictate something to ChatGPT and it will write out a wonderful essay just because you told it to. Much an easier process than it used to before. Or at the same time, like you and I discussed today here already, that you need to know the limitations of the models, you need to have a background understanding of what you want and what you do not want, and you need to follow the evolution of them. And actually the institutions themselves will also follow the evolution of those models, and the environment will change, right? Some expectations will be higher, some may be a little bit lower. So what are your thoughts on the impact on the educational space, specifically with people with disabilities? Is it a positive or negative, or is it usually somewhere in between?
Yeah, so the impact on people with disabilities, I think I spend a lot of time looking at that. But also as somebody who doesn't come from the English-speaking environment, for many people globally, the primary disability is not speaking English, right? It's just imagine how much of the world you cut off from, the world of knowledge, entertainment, just by not being able to speak English. And I've worked in many countries around the world, and I know that's what enormous amount of work it is for people to acquire English. And so just the fact that these things are multilingual in a kind of a global way, even though not perfectly multilingual, I think that in own is an impact. And when you look at the impact of somebody who's not a native speaker on reading in English or trying to compose in English, it's not that different from the impact of dyslexia, where all of a sudden the cognitive load is higher, so you cannot spend all of your you put all of your mind towards the thinking process. A lot of your mind just goes towards that sort of putting letter after letter and word after word. So what you said, like the dictation kind of offloads some of those issues. And the same thing goes for maybe composition and grammar and things like that. Just choosing the tenses and choosing the articles and so like that. That's quite an overhead for somebody who has to kind of slow down a little bit. So that's a very basic thing. But of course, and there's that sort of perceptual issue. So the new multimodality that kind of is hugely beneficial for people with sight impairments. All of a sudden, I've discovered for many people, it's just easier to take a screenshot of a busy web page and paste it into ChatGPT or Gemini or Claude now. They're all multimodal, and ask what's on this web page. What does it say about that? What can I do on this web page? And even though, again, you have that danger of hallucination, but often such a busy page, it's kind of quite hard to access using a screen reader or using some other tool. Even though you're not getting perfection, you just get still a better experience. So, or just do Control A, Control C, Control V. Just copy that whole thing and just paste it into ChatGPT and ask a question, even without the multimodal stuff. So that's like an example of helping people with perceptual difficulties. And again, none of that is perfect, but often it's better than the status quo. And then the final thing is, of course, is the cognitive support. So I wrote this article on LinkedIn called talking about the idea of using chatbots as a cognitive scaffolding engine. Mm-hmm. So in a way, you're kind of helping your cognition. So if you're struggling with attention, or if you're struggling with the ability to process large amounts of texts, and all of a sudden you have this tool that can not just summarize things for you, but can make you a list of key terms, or give you more examples to learn something. It can give you a list of propositions in a really dense paragraph. What are the simplest possible sentences that you can make? And then it can even make you a list of bullet points that you can then, and nowadays you can sort of generate a mind map from them using some code. So you can do all of those things. All of a sudden, that's very helpful, right? And you're still kind of responsible for your own understanding. So you have to, within the limitations, it may have made a mistake. It may have, so you still cannot sort of rely on it always being accurate. But nevertheless, you offloaded a lot of your cognitive load, the overhead of the cognition onto this cognitive machine, and then you can kind of spend your time focusing on the thinking that you're doing, on targeting your cognition in the right level. And of course, there are also emotional aspects. So all cognitive issues going to come with their emotional limitations. Such as for people feeling very stressed out. People look at I've talked to people with dyslexia, so it's like what? It's just like the text is pushing back at me, like pushing me away from itself. Just like it really kind of a feeling that people feel kind of tired, more irritable, but also just kind of feeling bad about themselves. Like they can't do this basic thing, and so that it can help with that. But also, many people just help with that sort of outlining and drafting. That first, that blank page, the terror of the blank page. So that can overcome some of that. So that's definitely an area where many people are already taking advantage of these of the sort of the rich semantic nature of these tools. And we always have to be mindful of the fact that these are not sort of database lookup or factual tools, but they help with these relationships. And that's kind of what we're trying to do when we're trying to understand a concept or text or deal with sort of rich complex data. We're trying to kind of figure out some sort of cognitive relationships, maps, outlines, and so on. And these tools can help us with the process and reduce some of the cognitive overhead and the emotional overhead that goes into that sort of wall of text that sometimes you're presented with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Those are very good examples. I feel those are very good examples, and I guess we'll just have to wait and see how it turns out, whether or not it will be a net positive or a net negative. Hopefully a net positive, because I feel like the tools are there. We can make the impacts if we raise the literacy levels of everybody using the AI, both institutions and individuals, and trying to make it a better place rather than just utilizing everything that we can just for the sake of using it for profit, and that's it. A little goes a long way in that regard.
I think at the moment it's definitely a cognitively net positive. Some people feel differently about it, but I like to think about people often talk about neurodiversity, but we're diverse, and that often just means dyslexia, ADHD, autism, things like that. But actually, I like to think of neurodiversity as like truly a huge heterogeneity of the human kind of neurocognitive profiles that we all have. And sometimes people struggle without realizing they may have that a label might apply to them. So I think for those people, if they find the right approach, and if they get the right guidance and the right support, I think this is definitely a net positive. And I think if you talk to people who've kind of taken the time to explore that jagged edge of that frontier of capabilities, and I think they usually kind of feel the same way. But it would not be that difficult to find examples where somebody used it and was misled, like the lawyer in the US got fired because they didn't know that it might make up a case or something like that. So obviously it's not that difficult to find negative examples, but I think on balance, the positive and definitely the future, as we're going to learn, as we collectively have a higher level of awareness of where these things fail and where they succeed, I think I can only imagine being a net positive. Of course, we don't know what the future iteration of technology will bring, and so there's many unknowns. But let's say we kind of froze the world as it is today, or maybe just kind of one more generation of the technology that we have right now. I definitely would imagine that once we kind of settle into the groove of the AI, that it will become definitely a net positive for humanity. For the languages, for the cognition, for the just kind of bringing people closer to, giving people a chance to come closer together in understanding. Of course, that whether they take that opportunity or not, that will be a different question.
Well, let's hope that they will have at least a chance to make the right choice. Well, since our time is running out, I would love to continue this conversation indefinitely, but we need to stop somewhere, and it is a very large conversation. Dominik, thank you very much for joining us today. I think it was it was very insightful, very lovely hearing you talk, and I think we can have these conversations every 3 months nowadays, and they will be completely different in terms of how and what tools and where they are. So keep an eye on that, everybody else at home. Thanks for joining us today on Innovantage. Thanks to listening to us. Thanks to Dominik for joining us. And if you want to hear us talk about more stuff, if you want to see what else we can discuss, feel free to like, share, subscribe, and leave your comments down below or somewhere on the right or on the left or whatever else the comment section may be on whatever platform that you are consuming this content on. We would love to hear more from you guys and help you find your edge in this very competitive environment. Other than that, that's about it. Thank you very much for joining, and see you next time on the next episode. Bye-bye.